Okay, we want to be continuing our conversation on knowing how to help teens or adults avoid today's cultural norms. And the topic that we are going to be talking about for the next 2 weeks are eating disorders. Eating disorders. And I want to warn you that probably the first half of this presentation is going to be presenting how the culture makes the diagnosis and how they prescribe treatment and what kind of prognosis or hope that they offer to a person who has been given this diagnosis. And the diagnosis generally comes from the medical community. And if the medical community, not if, more than likely the medical community will enlist the psychiatric community to go ahead and partner with them to try to deal with the thinking of that person. Please keep in mind that in a general statement, the medical community and the psychiatric community or psychology is operating from the cultural norms. They are not operating from a Judeo-Christian point of view and value. And this is important for us to understand. So we are going to talk for the next 2 weeks of 2 eating disorders. The one that we're going to talk about tonight is anorexia nervosus. Anorexia nervosus. And the one next week, if we finish up tonight on anorexia, is bulimia nervosus. Now, anorexia means lack of appetite. Lack of appetite. And you can almost hear in the word anorexia the word anxiety. So it means lack of appetite. Nervosa is related to nerves. So what they are saying is that this is a nervous condition that affects a person's desire to eat. But it's more than that. And I'll present an expanded diagnosis from the medical community here in a few minutes. Bulimia means insatiable appetite. And of course, with nervosis on it, it's related to nerves. So again, nerves are the influence for a person who has an insatiable appetite, who is always wanting to eat. And these are the 2 basic types of eating disorders even today. So having said that, let's take a look at some symptoms. Let's take a look at some symptoms, okay? Resistance to maintaining weight at or above a minimally normal weight for age and height. Now, there is a chart that doctors use and psychology uses as well when they feel like they have run into this condition, that your age, at your age, you should be maintaining a certain weight for your age and for your height. And if you fall below that, and through a series of questioning and different psychological scales that they use with these questions, then the person is diagnosed with anorexia. Another symptom is intense fear of gaining weight or becoming fat. Even though they are underweight, and they become preoccupied with gaining weight, even not just pounds, but ounces. I remember dealing with a couple, and she was diagnosed with this. She would weigh herself. She worked full time at a high-end lawyer's firm in downtown Chicago, and she would weigh herself 3-4 times a day. And if she picked up an ounce or a half an ounce, then she would go ahead and regurgitate to get down to the weight that gave her supposedly comfort and peace of mind. Another symptom is disturbance in the way in which one's body weight or shape is perceived, or denial of the seriousness of the current low body weight. So if they look at themselves in the mirror and they don't like what they see, and if that is combined with increase of weight, then they will take measures to refrain from intake. And it will become very, very serious to where, if this is persistent in, they'll wind up in the hospital. Their medical doctor will put them in the hospital in order to reach a minimum weight before they are released. And this is what happened to this young lady at least twice when she was under counsel. Another symptom is infrequent or absent menstruation periods. This will affect the hormones. This will affect a woman's body and what God created for the cleansing process in her body because of the lack of eating and the impact that that would have. Now, those are symptoms. What are some causes that they suggest? Well, first of all, some point to genetic or environmental factors. So some say this is outside of your control. You are being impacted, say, by the environment, and that could be anywhere from family dynamics to work-related to marriage, or you have a genetic disposition, and oftentimes the doctor and the psychologist will take detailed family information to find out if the next of kin, if a parent struggled with this. And they'll go back 3 or 4 generations. If mom did not struggle with this, and this is primarily, eating disorders are primarily female related, not male, they'll say, well, it skipped a generation because your grandmother had it. Always looking for, in their mind, the cause. Now, if they were to be able to validate that, okay, grandma had this, and it is supposed to be a predisposition genetically, then how was it transmitted, and what can be done about it if we're going back 40 years in the generation? They go on to say, quote, yet no factor or combination of factors have been identified as the cause of this damaging condition. This comes from their own publication of Psychology Today. So they propose this as a possible cause, but they, in very small print, say, we really don't know what the cause is. Another cause that they propose, it is clear that there is no single cause for anorexia and that it stems from a mixture of social, psychological, and biological factors. However, there is considerable debate over how much each of the known causes contribute to the development of anorexia. So again, they're bringing in three major areas: social, psychological, and biological. But we don't know how much of any one of these three is making a contribution that we can say there is a cause. All right, what about diagnosis then? Most common diagnostic tools are the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is also known as the DSM, DMS, depending on what version it might be. I think we're up to version 5 at this point. It could also be version 5R, which means version 5 has been revised. That's what the R stands for, as well as the World Health Organization's International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems. That's a mouthful. And both of these are secular manuals. These are the Bible for the medical and the psychology professionals that they refer to. And so they will take the symptoms that the person says, or whoever brought the person, and ask the questions and take notes. And then, if they have not dealt with this quite a bit, they will go to these two volumes and measure the symptoms against a variety of different diagnoses from these manuals and draw a conclusion. Now, the diagnosis is based on a combination, now watch this, of behavior, that's of the person, reported beliefs and experiences by the patient, so in other words, subjectivity, and physical characteristics of the patient: height, weight, how many meals do you eat a day? Do you purge after you eat? Different things like this. Now, the presentation features are several. From a psychological point of view, they have a distorted body image. They are preoccupied or obsessed about food and weight. The couple that I worked with were newlyweds, probably maybe a year to 18 months. And he was very patient and very loving. And she did not want to go out and eat at a restaurant. The smell of food caused her, in her mind, to become nauseated. And I can remember having a conversation with her about this preoccupation about food and her weight. I asked her to describe the smell of her favorite food at one time that she used to eat. And Chicago's got some really great pizza places. And she would, Giordano's, talk about going to Giordano's when they were dating. And she enjoyed the food and the taste and the blend of herbs and different things like this. But in her mind, even though she had not ate at that restaurant and she had no previous problems with eating at that restaurant, just the thought of going into that restaurant and smelling those delightful smells, in her mind, she was afraid that she would throw up. It was a fear that she had. And we talked about it, and she did not throw up. Part of the reason was that they didn't go to the restaurant anymore. And I asked her, what's the worst possible thing that would happen if you went to that restaurant and you sat down and you ordered your favorite pizza and you took the first bite. What's the worst possible thing that would happen? And she told me, I would be afraid I would throw up. I said, okay, we're going to play the worst possible thing game here. So, what's the worst possible thing about throwing up? Well, I would be embarrassed. What's the worst possible thing about being embarrassed? And we went on for a while, and then she finally seemed to have the light go on. So, what's the big honking deal? And they started going back to that restaurant and began in small portions for her to enjoy the cuisine that restaurant offered. She had this preoccupation with food and her weight, and it was a dominating fear in her life. Many of these people are perfectionists. Perfectionists. They have conceived in their mind that they want to be a certain weight and have certain features that they have convinced themselves that other people would appreciate and love them more and better. Many times they have a rigid personality. There's very little flexibility in their personality. And then with the women, they avoid taking risks. They avoid taking risks. Now, emotionally, they struggle with low self-esteem. This can lead to clinical depression. Now, stop for a moment and think about this. Antidepressant medications can be fairly strong medications. And most of the time, it's recommended that you take any medication as a rule with food, but especially antidepressant medications. Now imagine this person not eating or limiting how much they eat, and they're taking this strong antidepressant drug. Do you think that is going to upset their stomach? You think that's going to trigger fear in their mind? Now, something else I need to avoid. They have the fear about becoming fat and difficulty expressing emotions. They are ashamed of what they are doing with their intake of food. And deep down inside, they realize this is really, really silly. This doesn't make sense what I am doing. Why am I not listening to people who love me? And then, as far as interpersonal or social, they withdraw from relationships. And oftentimes, the family dynamic deteriorates. The family dynamic deteriorates. Physiologically, you have the cessation, the pausing or even stopping of the woman's monthly cycle. You have starvation symptoms. And what would that look like? Slow heart rate, hypotension, hypothermia, anemia. You have growth of langugo hair, Lanugo, hair all over the body. That's the way for the body to keep the heat in. But for a woman, this is a unseemly physical appearance that is only going to complicate her perspective about her own body. There would be a zinc deficiency, Z-I-N-C, zinc. Body mass less than 85% of the normal height and age, and the possibility of placid complexion or sunken eyes, hollow eyes. Now, some of this is extreme cases, but these are things, if you are talking with people, that you might make observations about. And then there's behavior, all under presentation features of behavior, excessive exercise, and food restrictions. There was a lady who was struggling with anorexia and wound up at Walter Reed Mental Institution, which is a county-run psych ward. And as she was being admitted, I was there with her along with another person. The doctor was doing the intake with her, asking her questions. And you know what she was doing? She was doing deep knee bends in the office. Excessive exercise. Why? To keep the weight that she thought that she should have. This can lead to fainting and then possible self-harm, substance abuse, or attempted suicide. All right, so what's the prognosis? Well, there is a whole ton of medical risks. You have cardiac abnormalities, low blood pressure, low body temp, low white cell count, cold intolerance, chronic constipation, osteoporosis, infertility, dry skin, hair and nail loss, and possibly death. Now, what are the treatment options? And I didn't expect you to get all that, but just to listen to the hopelessness that the culture is offering. What are the treatment options? Focus on immediate weight gain and stabilization. The medical community believes that if the person for her age and height reaches the appropriate the appropriate weight level, then they are out of danger and they can build on that progress through counseling and psychology. If the situation is serious, they will hospitalize the person. Another treatment option is dealing with a physiological disturbance. By this, they mean addressing the patient's low self-esteem, possibly a family issue, maybe perfectionism, pleasing others, etc. Another treatment option is the goal is long-term remission or rehabilitation. Long-term remission or rehabilitation. And oftentimes there is medication therapy. Medication therapy. The administration of certain psychotropic medications and certain SSRI or serotonin. However, neither medication nor medication combined with behavioral therapy show evidence of being effective for helping the anorexia patient recover from this acute illness. With reference to psychotherapy, only a random control trials were conducted and no specific type of psychotherapy seems to show any overall advantage when compared to other types. So, this can be very, very discouraging for the person who has this eating disorder. It can be discouraging for the prognosis. It can be discouraging for the treatment options. To have the counselor and or / medical community say, we just want to bring you to a certain level and hope that you'll continue to improve through psychology and through counseling. Never finding the root cause. Never finding the root cause. Anorexia just doesn't suddenly happen. It is a combination of things that develop over time. And generally, the person with this diagnosis understands there's something wrong. Uh, this is this is strange behavior. I've never done this before. And they try to process themselves to discover what it might be, but it becomes in the shadows because they get convinced about their weight and their appearance and different things like this. And then they get dropped into the medical and the psychological communities where now this is something that is going to be a struggle for the rest of your life. And suicide, unfortunately, oftentimes is the last resort option for people with anorexia who are extremely defeated with the cultural norms that they have been exposed to. So let's talk about biblical solutions now. This is where the hope is at. Biblical solutions, okay? Anorexia is a learned behavior. I'm going to say that again. Anorexia is a learned behavior. Just like any sinful lifestyle is a learned behavior. And if you can learn something, you can unlearn it and replace it with the biblical solution. It's not a disease. It's not a mental illness. I read you several quotes from their own people who said, we don't know what the cause is. We think it might be this. No tests have been accurately developed to prove that it is a mental disorder. Therefore, you and I must approach this problem with the understanding that it is a learned behavior. We need to gather information that will show a preconditioning or other significant people who display the same behavior that the person has observed and mimicked. Remember, we taught a brief counseling class, and there were 3 levels to a problem. You had the presentation. That's what the person thinks the problem is. You had the performance. That's what the person is doing. And then you have preconditioning. That is how they have been influenced by somebody else with the same sinful lifestyle as they observe that person avoiding consequences, shunning responsibility and personal discipline, and getting away with it. So why would I try something different when I can repeat what my daddy did? We have to insist upon a complete medical examination and evaluation. This would include blood work. This would include a variety of different tests, such as searching for a hormone imbalance. Sometimes the hormones are too elevated, sometimes they are too low. Even looking for vitamin deficiencies. All of this can be done by somebody who has a clear understanding of biblical counseling and is willing to work with that person to rule out any physical problems that could be contributing and or could be the cause. You know, a hormone imbalance can cause a person to act crazy, to do things that they normally would not do because there is a hormone imbalance. So we need to gather good information. I think this starts out with, what is the person's personal relationship to God? Is she saved? Does she demonstrate a sensitivity to and conviction of sin? Is there a receptivity to the instruction of God's word? What is her view of God? Is it legalistic? Is it permissive? Is it grandfatherly? We need to examine the history of food-related problems in the family structure. What is her relationship with her parents, her siblings? Do others in the family structure struggle with food? Are there people in her family structure that food is comfort to them when they don't know how to handle life's problems? What are the circumstances surrounding the very first incident with anorexia? First time they overate, in their opinion, and they purged. What was going on? Who was there? What were the circumstances? What was happening? And what are her eating patterns now? We need to look for perfectionist tendencies. Does she have a desire to please a parent or a coach or a boyfriend, or to fit in with friends and peers? Young people in high school oftentimes struggle with anorexia, especially if they're involved with sports, because an unthinking coach can just say something so simple that it can throw that teen into a tizzy. For example, Susie, if you would lose about a pound or two, you could clear those hurdles and you can probably shave off 2 seconds on your 100-yard dash. And if the person wants to please that coach, guess what she might do? And especially if the home environment is not encouraging. So we need to examine her concept of God and her relationships. What are the circumstances surrounding the first incident? Okay, look for perfectionist tendencies. Have they a desire to please a parent, a coach, boyfriend, etc.? How does she define success? How does she define failure? To her, what is good or bad? Is she using food to manipulate others because she is unhappy with how her life is? Is she fearful of someone or something? Now, there's some specific counseling steps that I might suggest to you. For example, as I mentioned earlier, you need to recommend, if she is an adult on her own, to get a complete physical examination. Now, let me mention this if I have never mentioned it to you before. This would go in educating her parents if she's a minor. This would go if she was married to her husband. This would go to her if she is single. You need to teach her how to make an appointment and interact with the doctor. Well, Rick, what do you mean by that? Oftentimes, when you go in to see a medical profession, even if it's your regular doctor, oftentimes, well, how are you feeling? And you blubber out how you're feeling. Guess what? You have just diagnosed yourself, and you have made it easier for the doctor not to do his job. Or if it's the first time, what brings you here today to see me? And you blubber out what brought you in. Now, a medical profession, there's nothing wrong with those questions if they proceed with asking additional questions and running the appropriate tests to look for the cause and not simply accept what the patient has to say. You want to know her optimum weight. What is her optimum weight? What's a reasonable time frame to achieve that goal? Diet plan, including vitamin supplements, might be helpful. Now, let me clarify diet plan. Eating proper nutrition is what I mean by a diet plan, not withholding food. She doesn't need to lose weight, but to have proper nutrition. And then physiological changes as she gains weight. She has to readjust her thinking that she put on 2 or 3 ounces or put on a pound. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with doing that because you're underweight anyways. And then appropriate levels of exercise. Appropriate levels of exercise, not going to the extreme. Should review the doctor's plan for eating and exercise and help hold her accountable and include the parents if she's a minor. Have her list her personal goals for addressing her behaviors. What do you want to accomplish? Well, I don't want you to do things to please someone else. What are your goals? And you might have to teach her what a biblical goal is. You might want to incorporate what her body is according to the scriptures. Is the temple of the Holy Spirit, and she is to treat her body as such. Reinforce the parents' or the mate's role of support and accountability. Because people with eating disorders generally withdraw and it becomes a personal struggle. And because of the shame of it, they choose not to share their struggle or even their progress at times. Have her list her fears and anything she feared she would lose by following this structure. In other words, what's the worst possible thing that could happen? Reinforce hope and her responsibility. Nobody can do this except her and her relationship with Christ. And then continually teach the difference, and this is important, the difference between the fear of the Lord and the fear of man. Eating disorders are the fear of man's perception of me. It's not the fear of the Lord. And then get her involved in the Word of God so she can see herself like God sees her. Begin to recognize who God is to her, and self-discovery of biblical solutions, and also the sanctification process listed in 2 Peter. Next week, we're going to talk about helping somebody with bulimia. I know I gave you a lot of information. Questions that you might have.
I've just got a comment.
Yes.
They're finding out now that there's a lot of this going on in young boys, too.
That is something I did not know. My research is a little bit dated. In my day, it was strictly related to young ladies in particular, but we discovered it in mothers as well. That's interesting. I guess I should go back and update my information and see what evidence that they are presenting that this is could be a male centered problem.
Right. And I didn't say that to, think that your information was old or anything. I just said that. And I think a lot of it's just this pressure that we put on the kids.
Cultural norms, absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah. Good observation, Sue. Thank you for sharing. Somebody else? Anybody else? If you want a copy of my notes from this section, just email me and I'll send them to you as an attachment, because I know I gave you a lot of information. The purpose of giving you some of the background on the medical and the psychological community is just to help you understand the cultural norms that parents as well as their children are encountering when they discover that their child has an eating disorder. I don't find much hope in the presentation from the medical or the psychological community.
Pastor.
Yes, ma'am.
Would you use some of the way they diagnose it, though?
The only time, that's a great question, Sue. Pat yourself on the back and go have an ice cream bar afterwards, okay?
I already patted.
You already patted yourself on the back. The only time I use this DSM, I think, like I said, it's up to 5, Diagnostic Statistical Manual. The only time I use that if I run into a situation that I am not familiar with, I'm looking simply at the description in the book. That's all. This manual, these people who have developed the manual have been such great students of gathering data through questions and interviews and things like that, and organizing them so a layperson can look at that and say, oh, okay, here is quote unquote the label, or this is what they are saying. And the descriptions are accurate for the most part, but the DSM tells you up front that the book is only for description. It is not for prognosis. It is not designed to recommend treatment options. And the only treatment options as a rule that you will find is either group therapy or medication. That's the only 2 things that they can offer. So it has a limited value, but as you grow familiar, Sue, with the scriptures, you could take what I've given to you tonight and you could probably find a character in the Bible who had a lot of these descriptions that were assigned to anorexia. Not that it's going to record that they were purging, but just some of the descriptions that are there as well. That makes sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
All right, Tuesday night, Ecclesiastes chapter 3. We are not going to take a look at the first 8 or 9 verses where it says a time to sow and a time to reap and a time to plant and a time to tear up, etc. I did a series of that is posted on the channel. So all you have to do is go to the channel and hit, I think, all videos or whatever, and then scroll down towards the bottom and you will see all those verses. So we're going to pick it up after that in chapter 3. Thursday, we start a new series on worship. Sunday, we will be taking a look at Abel. Why does God record Abel as a man of faith? He's only got one short verse, but there is a lot of information when you go back and take a look at the historical content that we can draw from, that we can learn how to be men and women of faith. And then Sunday night, we will come back to bulimia. Well, if there's no other questions or thoughts, anybody have any comments about Sunday morning, the message, anything confusing about that?
I thought